Chapter 3.8, Part 4, Post-Impressionism. So the Impressionists have been around a little while, and some artists were criticizing them for lacking substance and being too preoccupied with beauty and, beautiful scenery, as we saw with Monet, like some of the water lilies and things like that, or pretty people doing pretty things. So the post-impressionists wanted to differentiate themselves from simplicity. They wanted to get into some abstract qualities and some different subjective content. So we start to branch off into a couple different ways of depicting imagery. Paul Cézanne here, now he does what Monet does in this way, where he paints this same mountain and this village over time, and it's kind of interesting because he, more than a lot of artists, you can really see the developmental change of where he started, where things are fairly realistic looking, and then they get more and more sort of cubist looking. He starts to break things down into planes, into flat areas, like the buildings and the fields and so on like that. But the mountain starts to get into kind of flatter areas. The shadows look fairly flat. He's not interested so much in depth of field. He's not interested in making things look in a perspective, with the atmospheric perspective. What he's actually doing is putting some cool colors mixed in with warm colors. So when you think about linear perspective, atmospheric perspective, when things get sort of hazy and bluer in the distance, and in the foreground they get more crisply defined and sort of slightly warmer colors, he's pushing this around. So he's putting, yellow field next to green. He's putting pale, yellowish brown next to purple. So he's kind of making things flatten out by putting these colors next to one another. The receding and the foreground background kind of way of looking at things with those colors is shifting. Plus, he's kind of defining things all in one. One other thing I meant to say about the Impressionists, and this moves forward as well, when we're looking at a photograph, everything's in focus. So that's something that affects painting as well. So he painted this many times over. They get abstracted, and he's blending warm and cool to create push-pull. I'm not going to compare this. The book is asking me to do it. I'm going to pass. So Gauguin here, his stuff is so distinctive. His figures and his coloration really is mainly the things that tell you it's a Gauguin painting. So he gets into flattening the space. He's kind of going further even than Cézanne. You can't even really tell where things are happening other than we have a larger figure in the foreground, medium, and then things are getting smaller as they recede. But this one is Jacob wrestling with the angel. Things are fairly flattened out. He doesn't want to depict, Gauguin does not want to depict regular folks doing things. He wants to go for purity and for sincerity and spirituality. And he leaves not long after this. He goes to Tahiti to get away from the encroaching industrial culture. He's trying to get back to rural beliefs and religion and purity, although in Tahiti he contracts syphilis and dies. Okay, so he's trying to portray those untouched by materialistic values. So they're experiencing a vision of a sermon they just heard. So that's kind of an interesting symbolic way of doing things. He's not a symbolist, but he influences the symbolists. He's a post-impressionist, which is kind of vague, but that's what he is. So Van Gogh, he counts as a post-impressionist. He also counts somewhat as an impressionist as well, because you get a bit of that optical mixing, like how the moon is glowing and these stars are glowing, and he's mixing in dark colors with light colors. So the Impressionists, of course, or, you might say the art critics have kind of put him into a few different categories. He's kind of like Picasso later, and Rauschenberg. Everybody kind of wants him in their things, but he's really very individualistic and very identifiable in his own style, as we well know, because I'm sure you knew what a Van Gogh looked like before you ever took this class. So it's got these sort of hard outlines on everything. He decides to depict reality in terms of scenery and landscape composition, but he's taking it in an emotional way. He's showing his emotional perspective on that reality. He's mentally ill. We know that very well. It's well documented. And this was painted, I think, shortly before he died. So he lived with Gauguin for a brief time. And they got on each other's nerves. They don't have as much information on Gauguin's state of mind. Of course, he went off to Tahiti when he died. But obviously, Van Gogh is mentally ill. The two of them did not get along. There was more expectation that they'd be closer friends, and then, of course, Gauguin goes off and sleeps with this prostitute that Van Gogh thought was all his. It was kind of his own delusion. And he gets upset, so he cuts his ear off. And then he gets institutionalized on and off after that. All right, so Hokusai is an influence that we're looking at, with some of the imagery that Van Gogh had. So that's just something to think about. All right, Camille Claudel, great film called, is it called Camille? I think it is. Amazing. Oh, done in the 80s, French subtitles. But the story with her is that she and Rodin were lovers, and they were together. And I know it's lots of stories, but that's kind of where we are at this point in time with the art history. Very famous. She did a lot of the work for Rodin, did a lot of his sculptures, did a lot of the modeling in clay before it was cast and this and that. Didn't get any credit. And then she kind of loses her mind and becomes institutionalized because he won't own up to what he's done. And he was married anyway, so he didn't want to, live with her and have a life with her because he had a marriage. But this one is the lovers. It caused quite a stir because they're nude from the waist up, and they're sort of like in the midst of seduction and trying to get the dance finished off so they can, go off to bed and make love. So that was quite scandalous, 1889 to 1905, and especially for a woman. She was a highly skilled sculptor, judged, of course, differently, and her family placed her in an asylum where she spent the last 30 years of her life. Interesting film, though, if you ever choose to watch it. Here's Rodin's Kiss from chapter 1.2, and that's carved out of marble. But you can see some of the similarities of the sculpting techniques. I don't know how much of the carving she did per se, but she did a lot of the modeling. Okay, so Henry Osawa Tanner, and this is someone who studies with Thomas Eakins. So Thomas Eakins is the guy who we looked at that photograph of the physicality and where men are moving through space. And Henry Tanner is one of his students. And very few African American or, black people of any kind, in England or France would be doing any kind of artwork in the academy. But Eakins taught this fellow, and he gets this beautiful sort of impressionistic, but we are in post-impressionism. We still have that color mixing sort of in the background, but very soft and intimate, detailed image. And the passage between, a child and a father, or grandfather, sorry, I always forget, grandfather, teaching him the banjo. So it's kind of a thoughtful slice of life that has rarely been seen in terms of art at this time, because usually it's painted by a white person and they're depicting them in a particular way with entertainment and pleasing people, if that makes sense. And then this way, he's just focused on the boy and his plucking the strings. Beautiful textures in this piece. Oh, also influenced by Courbet, our realist. So he's confronting some stereotypes. Symbolism is our next ism. So many isms in this era, and we're just really in the thick of it. It won't end for quite a long time. So they're looking at Gauguin and they're thinking, oh my goodness, this is otherworldly. He's depicting the spiritual in a real situation in the world. We like this idea of this psychological and spiritual exploration. So we get Gustave Moreau. This is called The Apparition, 1876, oil on canvas. This is Salome in the middle here. And this is John the Baptist. So this is a biblical story of the seductress Salome, and she, I believe, orders his head to be chopped off. There's a bloody sword from a soldier over here that perhaps did the chopping. The king is over here, or sorry, I believe that's here, and I think that's a shrine. The king's over here, beg your pardon. So just this idea of the seductress. Symbolism is very sexual and erotic, but it's also touching on the spiritual. So it's ambiguous. It's like a vision or a dream. And if we remember, if we go back to Gauguin's influence back up here, then we see him after the sermon, these people are witnessing the vision. Does that make sense? So they're hearkening back to the idea that a vision could manifest itself in a space, in the picture, in the painting. Ferdinand Hodler. This is called The Night. I love the quality of the flesh in these paintings. Oh my God! And then we get into Klimt after this. Same thing. Klimt has some gorgeous flesh, but this one is super gorgeous. But it is a erotic piece. I mean, this is our artist here, Hodler here, being sort of encroached on or approached by death, but it's still somewhat erotic. It almost looks like death has decided to sort of get on top of him, almost in a sexual position. It's quite frightening, and that's probably why he allowed the death to get that close. There's a similar one that Klimt does, but not the same composition, but the same subject. But I don't have it to show it to you right now. So this is his lover. That's his wife. And there's another man here, and this was quite scandalous. All this flesh, my goodness, and all these multiple people in different areas. And it was known that these were two women he was involved with, and then his wife's got his arm over here. So, scandalous. There was a lot of eroticism in the symbolism, and he's frightened of this death character. You do see this symbol or this position of a creature, and this is the only time I've seen it where it's just black cloak, but a creature on top of a person while they're sleeping. That's an image you see repeated in art pieces quite frequently. So that's a symbol of death, kind of like the Grim Reaper. And then we're comparing Artemisia Gentileschi's piece. Remember where Judith decapitates Holofernes. Now look at Klimt's version. Holy smokes. Very soft. And here is Holofernes' head. And she's already killed him, and she still is very in the mood for love, might we say. And semi-nude. Oh my stars. How could this be happening? So in one part of the story that gives us some backstory is that Klimt was in love with our model here. She was actually a famous woman, and then her whole family was interned in camps in the Holocaust. Most of them died, and one descendant came back and said, "That is my aunt," and photos were dug up of their living room and showing all the kids sitting in front of a painting of Adele Bauer-Bach, I believe is her name. But there's a block, and there's a film about it. It's really interesting. But these pieces were recovered eventually back to the family. All right, so With the Klimt symbolism, it's filled with fantasy and eroticism, femme fatale, seductress, and that gold leaf. We didn't really get into Adele Bloch-Bauer. I had it backwards, sorry. So the gold leaf we see with Klimt, a lot of times he flattens the picture plane with this gold leaf. He loves to do that. And you see that in a lot of his other pieces. The Kiss is one of his famous works.